This is ASOSU presents Damn, What Now? Navigating Student Identity During a Pandemic with Amara, Safi, Hallie, and Hannah.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Hannah, and I'm here with my co-hosts. And today we thought we'd switch it up, and we're going to have the icebreaker question along with our intros. So I will be the example. So, hello, I'm Hannah. I use she, her, they, and she, they pronouns. I am the Director of Government Relations. And the question this week is, what did you want to be when you grew up, when you were 5 years old? So when I was 5 years old, I wanted to be a tap dancing equine vet. Despite not being around horses most of my life. But I did tap dance until I graduated high school. So that was there, that made sense. But being an equine vet didn't make any sense because I knew everything about horses, but did I ride them? No. Did I really go to a barn? No. My dance teacher, yes, let me go to the barn with her daughters. And yes, I did ride occasionally, and I went to horse camp once. But what mind did 5-year-old Hannah think she could be a vet? Tap dance, yeah, we could get on that. But yeah, so, yep, that's it.
That's pretty cool. My name is Safi, he, him, his pronouns. At one point, I'm pretty sure my parents have told me that I wanted to be a bus driver. I'm not sure. So there's a lot of background to that. My uncle used to come from, so back in Pakistan, there was a bus that came from the capital to the city that we lived in. And he used to bring us like little, like they used to have lunch boxes served in those buses. And so those lunch boxes, he'd always get some more, like for me and my sister, and then he'd bring them home to us. And so I always really liked what was in the lunch boxes. And so at one time I was like, I really want to be a bus driver for that company because I really like their lunch boxes. So that was that idea. But my official speech, I think that I gave in like a school setting or sometime, like in like kindergarten and grade 1, was a pilot. So that was one thing. I'm still interested in airplanes, so there was something there, but not really pursuing that anymore.
That's really cute. I actually have something similar. So my name is Amara. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the coordinator of wellness affairs, and I actually grew up in like rural Utah when I was up until like 4 or 5. And so all I really saw was like truck drivers and things like that. So when I was 5, I wanted to be a truck driver or a post male woman. So yeah.
Oh my gosh. You guys should just work together. I don't know.
No, we should just start a transportation kind of company.
Yeah.
So I'm Hallie, she, her pronouns. And I feel like I'm kind of boring. My mom said from a young age, I think medicine was like a thing. I used to try to ask to go to like the pediatrics office, which is ironic that I want to go into pediatrics now. But I did have a phase in life when between like 7 and 9 where I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Yes.
And that, I don't know why, but I think it was from watching Jurassic Park. Like I really liked that they like had dug up the bones and like got to see dinosaurs. And so I was like, I want to be an archaeologist. And my mom was like, absolutely not. Let's go back to the pediatrics office because that's not happening. But I still like to this day have a very interesting fascination with like archaeology and like where we find like bones and like all those type of things and fossils. I don't know why, but I have this interest in it. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really weird.
About it sometime.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
That's fun.
So I'm Jonathan Stoll, and I'm a bit of a contrarian, and I don't know that I ever had a dream of like I want to be something. And so I'm going to be in the spirit of being a contrarian, not answer your question and say, I don't know if you've listened to Michelle Obama, but she in her book Becoming talks about asking a kid what they want to be is actually the worst question you can ask a kid, because there's this idea that you will become something, that you will become a doctor, right? But think about it, as soon as you become that doctor, it's not as if you're there and you've made it. It's this idea that you never make it, you never become, because becoming is a process.
Oh my god.
That is
We're like
so
5
good.
minutes into this and John's already blown all our minds.
John's already blowing us away.
gotta take a breather for the rest of the one.
I was like, all right, I'm out.
Hey, but while I'm on it then, because I was a little disappointed. The question was a good question, and it was really appropriate to what we're going to be talking about, right? But if you haven't listened to their first episode, it's what I like to just call the fish episode, because the introduction to the first episode is a fish. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. When it's outside of water, is it wet, right?
Yeah, is the fish wet inside or outside?
Right, and so I'm gonna get a little philosophical on you, right? So I just recently became exposed to Taoism, and the first chapter of Tao Te Ching reads. So this is the first 2 lines. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So I would answer your question that the fish is. The fish is not wet. The fish is not wet. The fish is. So any characteristic that you would try to associate with something is inaccurate because the fish is.
The fish is just a fish, no matter if it is wet, it's inside or outside the water.
Oh,
The fish is, yeah.
I was ready for an ongoing debate and
Right, you can't argue with that, right?
yeah.
I mean, yeah, a fish is a fish. I can't
It
say
is,
it's not.
you know?
But
That
is a
really
fish
makes
outside the
arguments.
water or inside the water? No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
It is. All right. Well, that was enjoyable. As we mentioned in the last episode, the year will be coming to an end soon, and many of us will be graduating and moving into the next phase of our lives, which is, to me, really scary. But we brought John here, who is from the Career Development Center, and he's going to share some insights with us and talk to us about career development during this time, and also talk about his interest in serving students of color and minority students at the Career Center. But first, we have to move on to our feel-good story. So we got to do that. And in the
Important stuff.
of education and career, I found a really cute story. And I'm going to talk about Oregon's Regional Teacher of the Year Award. And that's Maya Pelayo, and she is really inspiring to me. So this news article said, with dedication and love to our career, everything is possible. So that's what she says about being a teacher. And she was born in Mexico and then moved to Oregon with her family when she was 13. And she said she devoted her time to her schoolwork and working in the fields. And she decided to become a teacher when she realized that she could help students who felt like she did when she was growing up. She had an accent, she didn't always know English very well, and so she really wanted to help students do that, like go through that process and be there for students when they're going through school, which I thought was really cool. And clearly, she was great because she has this award. But she said that she was really nervous about her accent, and she was really nervous about transitioning into career life and this professionalism, which John will talk about later. But she has this quote, and she says, the passion, so someone had asked her, like, what makes her a great teacher? And she said, the passion for trying to get my students to achieve their highest potential, even if there is a disability, behavior, poverty, language, culture, or anything that prevents them from learning. I believe in each one of my students, and I know that each one of them has a great gift. They just need someone to discover what that is, and I hope that that person is me. And I just think that I thought that was really beautiful. And then I really liked this quote from a student. She says, she's nice and pretty and she smells like flowers. And honestly, who doesn't want that to be said about them
Right.
by one of their students? So I thought that was really cute. But anyway, that's our feel-good story of the week, because as Amara and I mentioned right before we started filming and recording, we've been needing some good news. So there's our good news. But now that we have that out of the way, we're going to transition over to John. So John, if you could tell us about yourself and share about some of the work that you do at the Career Development Center, and also even just like tell us like what the Career Development Center is.
Yeah, so Jonathan Stoll serve as the Director of Career Education here at the Oregon State University's Career Development Center. So I'm about 5 months into the gig. I've been here at OSU for about 5 years, have worked in higher ed for 15 to 20 years. Mainly over in California, where I'm originally from. Shout out to those who are listening from the Bay Area. And, you know, a lot of, I think, what I wanted to talk about has to do with reframing and adaptability, particularly in a time like this. I think of how, 50% of the jobs that are going to exist 10 years from now don't currently exist, and how this pandemic has really accelerated that in many ways in terms of the jobs that are being lost. Retail will not look the same again, right? JCPenney's has gone out of business, is going bankrupt. Things will not look the same. Things are changing, right? So we'll get into that a little later. But so for me, this role in the career development, I wasn't actually really excited about it at first. My career trajectory had involved, diversity and social justice programming, some student activism, and then, community relations. And so I had always perceived, ever since I was a student at San Jose State University as my undergrad, the career education as being kind of corporate, being very white. It was patriarchal, right? I didn't have the language at that time. And I think in many ways we perpetuate these dominant cultural norms that students of color, students with marginalized identities don't necessarily always see themselves in. And so for me, this work, I approach it as being very spiritual, and I use that somewhat as a metaphor, but in other ways I mean it quite literally in terms of values and having faith in yourself and what is your purpose and your meaning, right? A lot of people have very salient spiritual identities, but then when we enter in higher ed, we're like, check that at the door. Like, we can talk about everything else, but we're not going to talk about faith because it divides us. Where I'm like, I consider myself to be a Quaker, a Muslim, a Taoist, a Sufi, like anything that connects and it gets at the heart and the spirit of who we are. So I encourage, if you're of a different faith than me, I don't care, lean into that, because that's going to make you a deeper person. And so when I think about the career process, I think of it as being very much focused on introspection. You don't master the interview until you've mastered the interviewing, right? You take that time to really consider where you've come from, what you've done, and where you're going. And so for me, it was a pivot in being able to approach this work and this opportunity as just that, an opportunity, and really reinventing myself. I don't know career development theory, right? I'm reading about it and learning as I go. And to me, it's not rocket science. And that's not to take away from anyone who studied career development theory and they know this stuff. More power to them. I'm trying to gather their knowledge, right? It's recognizing that we each have gifts. We all have that which is within us, that light to share with others. And I think oftentimes one of the biggest disservices students do is this lack of faith and believing in themselves. And so for me, it was believing in myself and cultivating this opportunity that I have something to share that is relevant and that will hopefully connect with students. And so the one piece of the job that I was really excited about was the fact that the work is, in addition to supervising 4 assistant directors who are housed within the academic colleges and supporting students. So College of Engineering, you have Eric White, who's an academic advisor. We have Britt and Carla and Claire also serving, I think collectively about 7 colleges, right? So they handle that. And then on my side, in addition to supporting them, I'm focused on our student affairs side of the house and the co-curricular. And so trying to engage students and helping them realize how their student employment experience translates and prepares them for their next career path, right? And particularly students of color, first gen, students with high financial need who, again, don't normally leverage the resources that we have at the Career Development Center. And so I'm trying to change that by, in many ways, changing how we talk about it, as well as intentionally going out and saying, hey, we have these resources here. You have a very valuable story and experience. Let's talk about how that translates into where you're going.
I, for one, John, just real quick, appreciate that, you don't have this specific background in career development theory. I think as a student, sometimes we really just want authentic conversation with just another person that can really advise and help us. And so to hear that you're also learning and just trying to do the best with the experience you have, I think for me just that resonated for a second, because it really means a lot to, I know myself, and let alone other students. I don't know how everyone else feels.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think it can be intimidating. because I've found that as I'm sharing resources during a workshop, I'll just throw a lot of stuff at students, right? There's the resume, there's the LinkedIn, the networking. Each of those things individually seems like a lot, but you know, I genuinely believe that, bring God into it again, that there's this perception that God is external to us, right? That all of the answers to all of our questions are outside of us, when to me, a lot of this stuff is intuitive. Like if you take the time to really think about it, you're like, oh, I know that, I've heard that. It's littered within our language, right? You could talk about failure and have Brene Brown talk about all of these things about failing up. And then we have adages like that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. That's the same thing, right? I drop hip hop lyrics, like where's my one about Drake, where he's talking about how he's learning, he's learned that he could see the positives out of negatives, like out of pictures, right? I'm not doing justice to the lyric, but that's about reframing, right? And looking at things like the glass isn't, 90% empty, there's 10% full. And it's not just positive thinking, but there's optimism, there's activism, and so yeah, I think there's a lot more than what we give us credit that we actually know.
Yeah, I think Amara would probably, being one of the bigger fans of Drake here, she could probably fill us in about that if she knows on the top of her head. I don't know.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I feel like it's a familiar lyric.
I got it right here. I learned working with the negatives can make for better pictures.
Sounds like something Drake would say.
Heard it straight.
But that's my thing, like, and I'm trying to develop a workshop right now where it's all on hip hop. So let's explore hip hop and all of this lyrics and the content in there that's relevant, right? So let's talk about professionalism. Let's break out some Outkast, So Fresh and So Clean, right? Like, it doesn't matter like I am fresh and clean. Like, this is how I show up, right? So just making it fun,
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples out there in music.
I would love that.
That's a very different approach, and I think what Holly mentioned is like coming from that outsider's perspective really gives you that unique lens that you look at through, and so bringing fresh ideas and things like that I really appreciate, and being like approachable in that sense, and just being honest that I might not know everything, but like I'll definitely try to help you with that as the best that I can. I think is very humble, and so
Agree.
It's good. It's good stuff. I was actually, one of my big questions was, what is your advice for us who will be graduating pretty soon? What is some advice and resources that you think that we should be taking advantage of right now at the Career Development Center, in terms of just like, I know I'd also like to hear some about your like remote delivery programming. What kinds of things can we do at like a social distance? All that jazz, to really help us right now, because it's a little bit, I'm a little uneasy right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is to name that these are difficult times, that you're not alone, right? You're not only competing with other graduates, you are competing with individuals who may have been laid off and are looking for their next. So, things don't look good right now. I think that's the reality. I don't think there's any way of sugarcoating the reality right now on the ground, right? My approach, again, is in terms of reframing and looking at things from a different perspective, looking at things from a different angle, is, one of the common questions that employers are asking people in interviews is, what did you do during COVID? Like, how did you approach that situation, right? And so really considering, what is your answer to that? You could say, yes, I binged Netflix, but right, is that differentiating you from other candidates? What are you conveying? What message are you saying in your response, right? As opposed to being proactive and taking initiative, right? So I can give you an example of me taking an initiative, and that translates to, as an employer, I have someone now who's a go-getter, who is autonomous, who's independent, right? So that's an opportunity for you to speak to that. And what I would tell you then, indirectly, hopefully what you can respond to that question is I did everything that I could right now to position myself for this opportunity, because I knew there weren't going to be that very many opportunities. So when I got in front of you, as I am right now, I wanted to make sure that I was prepared. And so this is what I did. I went and visited the Career Development Center. I checked out some of their workshops. I plugged into, I mentioned our assistant directors. I reached out to them and I asked them to have a conversation with me about my career options, or I asked them to review my resume. I used VMock, right, which is our tool on Oregon State where you can upload your resume, and it's an online algorithm, and it'll give you immediate feedback so that you can improve the formatting and the content of your resume, right? I got on LinkedIn and I created a profile, and I reached out to Safi after hearing this webinar, and I reached out to Jon, and I connected with them on LinkedIn, and I sent them a personalized message, right? Saying, hey, I'm listening to you right now on LinkedIn and I'm enjoying what I'm hearing. And I thought I'd just establish a connection, right? So I'm building that network. I'm following those companies that I'm really interested in potentially working at, like yours, so that when I'm in this interview right now, I know what's going on, right? Because this is an opportunity to, we talk about dressing to impress. Like, this is your opportunity to impress in general, period, right? Impress upon them the value that you bring. And if you have taken the initiative to do the research and you're able to ask very poignant questions, like, hey, tell me about your competitor over here, or this marketing campaign that you launched, like, how did it go? Or did you consider this challenge, right? You're showing that you're on top of it, that you are engaged, that you're interested in this employer. I think a lot of this is like dating, quite frankly. Like, you want that other person on the other side of that room to feel special, right? One of the things we do all the time, and I did this frequently, is have a customized resume. It's not customized, it's just a generic resume, right? So I got my resume and I'm just gonna start sending it out. Apply to as many jobs as possible, right? Thinking quantity over quality. When that person sees it, sometimes they might have a general sense that this is just a generic resume. You haven't made me feel special, right? Particularly in a cover letter, that's your opportunity to really emphasize your why. Why are you interested in this job? Why am I special? Why are you interested in me, right? You go on a date and someone has no interest in you, that's the end of the date. You want to feel special. So this is all about relationship building at the end of the day. It's about connecting with people.
Yeah, that's a really good comment, because I was thinking about, and I think in almost every single interview I've had, they've asked me the adaptability question, but like, how do you adapt in times of like stress or whatever? And I was just like, that question is going to be forever changed because of this time. But like for me, I think about when I was thinking about how I might answer that question, I thought about those things. Like, what did I do in this time that was proactive in changing my methods or our messaging? Like at ASOSU, like having to figure out how we're going to do voter reg through remote service and remote delivery. And so that's a really good comment about just like, how were you proactive during quarantine, and what can you say to those employers that are going to be asking you those questions? Anyways, I stepped on someone else who was going to.
Well, and one thing is then that provides an entry point to talk about leadership as well, right? So this is all about problems. Like, you're identifying problems and you're communicating how you solve that problem or how you provided leadership. And so, politicians do this really well, is having your talking points. And so regardless of what someone asks you, right? You ask me a question, or they ask you a question about adaptability, and you can start there. And then now you can start talking about leadership and this story, right? Storytelling is so important. Like, think about our cultures and how information is passed on from one generation to a generation. It's through stories oftentimes, right? We've lost that oral history, and we've moved into kind of a written age and now this technological age. But still, stories are instrumental to how we develop relationships with one another. And so really taking the time, again, through that interviewing and that introspection, to think about, what are the stories, what are the examples that I have of leadership, challenging or creating or solving problems, conflict resolution, leadership, adaptability, being ingenious or intuitive, or, I think those are all different ways of you being able to share your story.
So, Jon, I'm curious to know like your thoughts, and I don't know if there's a direct question I have, but at least for me, I've seen a lot of posts on social media and just like kind of everywhere of like people wondering like what employers were doing for their employees during the pandemic. I hear like a lot of conversation of like, if you're finding out that these companies aren't doing a lot for their employees during coronavirus, like that might be a good indicator whether you want to work for them or not. I don't know if you're hearing conversation about that, or like if you have like, I guess really I'm just wondering like what your thoughts are around like a lot of conversation of like people asking the employers these type of questions as well.
I may have missed the first part of your question because my children ran in here screaming. You didn't hear that, hopefully, because I muted myself. If I understand the question correctly, it was around COVID-19 and evaluating maybe how inclusive a culture is based on how they're responding in terms of the services that they provide.
Yeah. So like, and how, you know, employers during this time were treating their employees, and like how students going into the career field right now are like trying to gauge that. I don't know if you're having conversation around that, or like just your thoughts.
You know, I haven't heard about that exactly, but the initial thought that came to mind when you asked that question had to do with, can you hear them in the background? My kids? No? Okay. I didn't know if that was a problem.
Not too much.
Okay. It could get louder. Is around toxic work environments, right? And I think in a period like this, leadership or lack thereof is accentuated. Meaning that if you don't have a positive culture that encourages what I consider to be inclusivity and people showing up as their authentic self, if you're not compassionate and extending grace, right, and leading with the heart, essentially, then you're going to be in a whole host of hurt. Because yeah, I've heard of some, even at OSU, like some departments where there may not be a strong level of trust. And so then it becomes a matter of this perception that you are micromanaging me now because you're on my case all the time. And it's really a lack of trust is what it boils down to for me. And so, you know, I think about cultures or priorities within organizations where the focus is on a quota and you want to diversify your applicant pool, but you have a toxic work culture, and those individuals will never be retained by your employer because it's not the right culture. It's not inclusive. It doesn't value individuals for who they are and the gifts that they bring to the table. And so, yes, I think that can be a way of evaluating a culture, and if you see yourself as a part of that organization.
And that goes back sort of to your point about like doing your research and keeping a track of, I guess, what's happening amongst, you know, other companies that you might be interested in working with, and like seeing what's being done, and then, you know, like asking the smart questions like, oh, I saw this was what was happening and this was your response during this time, like, you know, what was the impact to your employees with that, and things like that. I think that sort of goes off of what John was saying about like keeping track of that, and then also just trying to maybe ask some smart questions to your employees or to the future potential employee that, you know, they could think of as you being a person who is standing out and providing that, you know, like that perspective.
Yeah, and I think you could ask pointed questions like employee resource groups, which are like affinity groups for people who share similar identities as you. And I think I just lost the train of thought. I'll stop there. But yeah, I think there's some pointed questions that you can ask people as well to get that information out of them. And I think it's important, I recall what I was going to say, is recognizing what are those things that you are not willing to compromise, right? Mm-hmm. Times are tough. You might need a job and you might be willing to accept certain things that you might not be comfortable with, right? So you have to figure out where that line is. What are you okay with, right? Maybe my employer doesn't allow me the time for Juma prayer on Friday. Am I going to be, is that a deal breaker? Or am I willing to go with that, right? I got to figure out, that answer could be different for different people, right? You got to figure out where that line is, because a lot of it is in terms of showing up with our authentic selves. Oftentimes we can't necessarily do that because that's going to make somebody feel uncomfortable, right? And so, you know, getting into code switching, right? That's something that, you know, people with marginalized identities have a strong skill at. And I say skill because ideally, normatively, you wouldn't have to code switch, right? But then on the flip side, that's how the world is, right? So we can talk about how the world should be, but we also have to operate within how the world is, right? And so really then flipping that idea of code switching is a skill, because you put a lot of white people might be comfortable in that boardroom. You put them in another setting, and let's say with a group of women of color, they might not necessarily be able to succeed in the same way, but that woman of color could succeed arguably in both of those environments, right? So looking at code switching as a communication skill. So how are we talking about and reframing our experiences and even the skills that we have?
Like writing down notes.
I'm writing notes down too. I thought that we could start getting into, you had sent us your LinkedIn post titled Career Centers Serve the Majority and Civilize the Minority. And I was reading through it and it was amazing. I learned a lot. It was really insightful. And I was hoping you can give a brief overview of kind of what you talked about. And then also if you could tell us a little bit more about why you led this workshop. Or wanted to lead the workshop. Obviously, the pandemic kind of put a wrench in things. Specifically, I was really interested too and interested in how you started it and started that line of thinking, because I'm really interested in how you even start to combat this professionalism and this like dominant culture centered in whiteness, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. So I'm really interested in how you even start like that process.
Yeah, I think it started with that perception that I think I opened up about, that this is the perception that students have of our career center, that students are not utilizing our services at the rate that we would want them to. And so for me, it started with, I got a request to facilitate a workshop, and this has been something that I thought about. And so I created a description. What the article talks about, and it's on my LinkedIn, and encourage you to take a look, was creating a workshop called Decolonizing Professionalism. So I'll read the description, which was, you're proud of where you come from, but you feel like an imposter where you are. You want to be professional, but without assimilating to dominant cultural norms and changing who you are. The workplace can be toxic, inequitable, and unfair, but you need a job. Learn how to be authentically true to yourself while managing the impression that others have of you by reframing and translating what you've done, where you're from, and who you seek to become. And so the article essentially goes on to draw a comparison between etiquette dinners and Thanksgiving, and ultimately posits that dominant cultural norms, what we think of as being professionalism, is in and of itself settler colonialism, right? And so this is really just taking my interest in equity, justice, and inclusion and approaching it in this space. And I learned afterwards, after reaching out to Shay over in ASOSU, she shared a couple of articles. So I'm not the first person to write about this, right? Maybe in this way, perhaps, but I'm just trying to say, I guess what it came down to was I entered into the career development space and started listening to and reading about diversity and equity within the career development space. And it left me wanting more. It left me a little surprised that, considering the very obvious connections as it relates to dominant cultural norms and how we perpetuate those, even within a higher education setting, that we should be doing more and at least naming the inequities that exist, right? And so what I go on to say in this article is just kind of drawing those connections and arguing that by not naming this, we are essentially perpetuating these same cultural norms. And one of the examples that I use is I was talking to a colleague, and she had a friend at an institution who, in a role, I guess, probably similar to mine, was interested in working with their EOP office or a cultural center, right, to provide tailored services to a group of students with marginalized identities, and they were told no. And so this is ultimately an attempt to say why we should be doing that, right? And I don't know if it's this article or something else that I'm writing right now, is just even this idea that you're serving minority students is wrong on a couple of levels. One, they're not minority students, they're students with minoritized identities, right? It's their identity that has been minoritized, right? Dick Gregory had said that white isn't a race, it's an attitude, right? It's a social construct. And so it's the same thing when we talk about professionalism. It's a construct. And so just naming it for what it is. And so in this case, it's very intentional that the Career Development Center doesn't necessarily have the reputation. A lot of students aren't aware of us, may not necessarily be aware of the services that we provide. and the values of what we're talking about with storytelling and being your authentic self, right? And so if we're trying to reach those students, if you don't trust me in the Career Development Center, well, let me work with the people that you do trust, right? So let me holler at Terrence over the Black Cultural Center. Let me work with Darian with the EOP and try to position the Career Development Center in a way that might, over time, develop a sense of trust, right? And so the first program that I did at the Career Development Center was an MLK Soul Force. We had never, I think, programmed during MLK Week. This is an opportunity for us to position and approach career development from a different lens, a different angle.
John, I have a question that, you know, might be a little, I don't know if it'll be tough to answer, or I don't know if there is even an answer, but specifically during these times when, you know, job opportunities aren't like growing, the people are definitely like unemployment is growing. Do you think having like the opportunity to be yourself with limited opportunities as jobs to try to, sorry, but like trying to be yourself in applying for jobs, could that be categorized as like a privilege when there's already limited opportunity? Could that be something that, you know, like because things are so like jobs, all the jobs aren't available, and so trying to find the perfect match, you, like you said, there are some things that we'll have to compromise, there are some things that you have to give and take. Do you think like trying to be yourself or anything like that and might risk, you know, the opportunities or available opportunities that you have, and so could trying to be yourself and be a privilege because that's not a risk, because you can be yourself and you don't necessarily, you know, like, you, do you know what I'm trying to say with that? I'm not sure.
Yeah. You know, I'll tell you what I was told by someone at the career fair. This was before the pandemic, and I asked this gentleman, an employer, a recruiter, what he looks for students. And one of the things that he responded with was that students often make the mistake of telling him what they think he wants to hear. He's already heard that a million times. He wants to hear you. Because if you give that script and you tell him what you think he wants to hear, you haven't differentiated yourself from everyone else, right? I think part of it is how you present yourself, right? Let's say you're an activist, for example, right? And you come in and you tell me an example of how you occupied the 6th floor of Kerr. That, you got to know your audience, right? So that example may work with a nonprofit organization. If I'm at a more conservative organization, that might scare me away. So how do I talk about that experience? Maybe I don't talk about how we disrupted the status quo. I'm talking about how I organized, and I did community organizing, and I brought a group of people together around collective action and outcomes. And this is what we accomplished. And this is the leadership I took, right? So I think a lot of it is, I really hate the idea of branding yourself, because it's this idea of kind of commodifying yourself and you're selling yourself. I think it's appropriate to some extent, as long as you're not selling your soul, right? Yeah. And being true to yourself. And so I think there's a matter of how you frame yourself, how you present yourself, because you can be that activist and present yourself as somebody who solves problems, who thinks critically, right? You have to be able to frame that experience and talk about it in a way that will resonate with the audience. And that's important, again, to do that research to know who your audience is. So yeah, as much as possible, I believe you got to be yourself, oftentimes recognizing that it doesn't necessarily pan out exactly that way, that there are certain things that you got to kind of trim around the edges and conform, unfortunately, in some ways. I think that's just the reality. But it pains my soul kind of saying that, because I want you to be yourself, right? Because no one could do you the way you can.
Right, and that goes back to the point of you, like what you said about what the world is and what the world could be. And so, you know, like what you have to sort of balance, I guess, that too. I don't know.
And it's different for every person, right? Like, you know, there's research that says that if your name, I think it's Miguel, but if your name is Juan, you're going to have a harder time getting a job than Jonathan, right? Am I going to tell you, Juan, to change your name? Of course not. But if that's something that you feel, I'm not going to hold you back from that, right? But it just, I wish it didn't have to be that way. If you're Black and you wearing dreads is a part of your identity. Like I don't want to be someone that tells you that you couldn't do that, but it could make getting a job a little bit more difficult, right? But who am I to tell you what that means to be your authentic self? For some, that may be a more difficult decision than others, but some of the things, it rests with you.
Yeah, I have a kind of a quick question because we're running low on time, but I have a question that kind of ties back to your article and what Safi was asking. But so like last summer I had an internship and it was like 100% white dominated, and I definitely didn't feel like welcome in the space often. And I was just kind of wondering what advice you would have for students of color or people with minoritized identities in like navigating those spaces. And it's kind of feels almost like futile to try and make a change. I know it's just like an internship, but like in the long run, thinking if I was to have that as a job, like for like a number of years, like how would you navigate those spaces?
Can I ask what made you feel uncomfortable or didn't feel a sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think it was just like the lack of connectivity you could have to people. Like I felt like their identities were very different than mine, and it was like a very white dominated space. And I felt like you couldn't connect well to other people in a lot of times, and so I feel like that's what kind of made it uncomfortable at times.
Yeah. And were there other interns as well? Because there's also that power dynamic as well, right? Especially if these are all, white professionals, quote unquote, and then here comes the brown intern.
Yeah, no, I was
Was that the experience?
I was the only intern there, and I was like the only brown person there too. So it was just like, I kind of had to do it for credit, and like I did not like going there. Like I liked the work I was doing to some degree, but like going there every day was just like I didn't like it very much.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of it, I'm thinking of my initial response to the fish question, right? It's kind of separating ourselves from even our ego and our experience and who am I? So it's kind of this philosophical approach, but that doesn't help you in that situation, right? In the moment, I mean, the initial thought I have is to tell somebody about that, like how you're experiencing it. And this might be even after the fact, but oftentimes like those people may not even be aware that this is your experience. Like they're just so clueless to the fact that an intern who doesn't share the dominant identity of this group is having a less than positive experience. But then that also feels like you having to do the work of educating everyone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of get to that whole idea that doesn't feel right either. I don't know. Does anyone else have a thought about how to navigate that? What do you do to kind of push back?
I mean, as an intern, I feel like it's really hard because you're just like, you're there for a temporary basis amount of time. So they also feel stepped on if you try to be like, oh, I want to do this big change. They're like, oh, no, you're just an intern. And so like that kind of power dynamic is definitely at play. And I also like experienced that.
Yeah, and I think you name it there. It's that we're addressing two situations here, both the power dynamic and then the racial dynamic as well. Yeah. And then throw in the fact that you're also a woman as well, right? You got a whole bunch of different things that are playing there. So yeah, I think part of it is maintaining a certain perspective. I hate to say like just, because I don't want to say accept things the way they are, but it is temporary. And so you just plow through and make the best of the experience, or you leave. There's terminology around like job crafting and relationship crafting, right? And a lot of it is looking at things from a different perspective. And so is there an opportunity then, if I'm at this place, can I work remotely? Maybe this just isn't a good environment for me to be in, but I like the work. And so having a conversation about creatively thinking, how can I get this experience in terms of work experience, but remote? Is there someone there? It sounds like in this place, is there, because oftentimes, even if this whole organization is toxic and creating this environment, if you have an ally or you have just one person there, that can make the difference, right? Just somebody that you can console. And it sounds like that wasn't the case, but that's what I would try to cultivate, is like focusing on that at least one relationship to help me make it through. If I'm committed to making it through, if I'm not, if it's so bad that I gotta leave, then I gotta leave. But if I'm trying to make it work, I think that could potentially help.
Yeah. Sorry for asking such a loaded question at the kind of last.
Yeah, that was a good question. You kind of stumped me, you got me.
But I think we're gonna wrap it up here. So if anybody else has anything they'd like to add, you can go ahead. But if not, thank you for the listeners for joining us today, and also to Jon, thank you so much for taking the time to give us really wonderful advice. So please feel free to reach out to Jon with any questions or concerns. We can link his information in the YouTube video, and then also you can search him on Oregon State's website as well. But as always, you can reach out to us at asosu.oregonstate.edu, and we regularly update our ASOSU Canvas page with COVID-19 updates. But with that, we would just want to tell everybody to be well and stay safe.
Go Beavs.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us today. Please reach out with any questions or concerns through our website, asosu.oregonstate.edu. There are regular COVID-19 updates on our webpage and ASOSU Canvas page. Be well and stay safe, Beaver Nation. Go Beavs!